From the moment Officer Colin C.J. Jennings laid eyes on the tall, dignified black man outside the convenience store in the sleepy town of Greenvale, he felt a prickling sensation of both unease and disdain. C.J., known for his quick judgments and abrasive manner, believed he had the world figured out. Criminals looked a certain way, spoke a certain way, and rarely walked free from his brand of street-side justice. What he didn't know, what he could never have anticipated, was that the very man he targeted, humiliated and arrested in public, was about to become his new boss, Greenvale's incoming chief of police. Greenvale was the kind of town you could drive through in 10 minutes if you caught a green light. Most people never gave it a second thought, nestled halfway between Houston and Galveston, Texas, overshadowed by the bright lights of the big city and the lure of the Gulf Coast. Its calm surface masked a complicated undercurrent, a place where not everyone was treated equally, where slow progress clashed with long-standing traditions. Still, for those who grew up there, Greenvale was home. For Officer Colin C.J. Jennings, it was the entire universe. C.J.'s family had lived in Greenvale for 3 generations. His grandfather had patrolled these same streets, baton at his hip. His father had worn the badge too. Law enforcement felt ingrained in C.J.'s DNA. Yet, while his father and grandfather treated the job like a solemn, dignified calling, C.J.'s approach was different. He saw policing as power, the ultimate role that made him judge, jury, and occasionally, in his darker moods, executioner. Most people in Greenvale recognized him by the sharp angles of his face, the permanent scowl on his brow, and the way he swerved his patrol car just to make sure others knew he was around. Greenvale's current chief of police, Byron Stokes, was set to retire at the end of the month. A gentleman in his early 60s, Stokes believed in community policing and fostering trust between officers and residents. He was known to knock on doors just to say hello, to share a cup of coffee in the local diner with folks from all walks of life. Though the force itself had its issues, unspoken biases, outdated training, Stokes tried to guide it toward fairness. He hoped the next chief would continue that mission, maybe even carry it further than he could. Word was out that the city council had hired an external candidate to replace Chief Stokes. In a surprising move, they bypassed the usual chain of promotion from within the department and instead selected a widely respected leader from a larger city. Rumor had it that this new chief had years of experience in Chicago's toughest neighborhoods and a track record of community engagement that had garnered multiple accolades, including a feature in the Houston Chronicle and an appearance at a policing symposium at the University of Texas. But few in Greenvale actually knew the new chief's name or what he looked like. The official announcement was scheduled for the following week, and the hush-hush nature only fueled curiosity. C.J., however, didn't care. As far as he was concerned, whoever the new chief was, they could never replace what he considered real policing, the kind of tactics C.J. believed in. He assumed this outsider would come in, wave around some city slicker credentials, and upend the department with soft-on-crime reforms. C.J. often complained to his peers in the break room about how these big city theories never worked in small towns. The more he ranted, the more he revealed his own insecurities. One blazing afternoon, while C.J. was out on his usual patrol, a call crackled over the radio. There was a possible disturbance at Hal's convenience store. A black male was seen arguing loudly with the cashier. C.J.'s heart quickened at the potential confrontation. He flipped on his siren, not because it was truly urgent, but because it made him feel in control. The entire drive, he pictured the scenario, a man, possibly armed or dangerous, needing to be put in place. He wore a grin of anticipation. When CJ arrived, the parking lot was almost empty except for an old pickup truck and a sleek black SUV with temporary plates. An older man in overalls lingered by the entrance, a worried frown on his face. CJ strode in, hand already resting on his holster, mentally rehearsing the speech he'd deliver if the man resisted arrest. Inside the store, the air conditioning hummed, and the fluorescent lights flickered ominously. He found the man at the counter, speaking calmly but firmly to the young cashier. He stood at least 6'2", dressed in plain khakis and a crisp button-up. Dark sunglasses rested on the countertop. A battered notebook and a pen peeked out of his breast pocket. CJ noticed the man's hands were large, well-kept, and unassuming. But something about him, his upright posture, the quiet confidence in his voice, made CJ instantly uneasy. The cashier's cheeks burned red as she stammered an explanation. He's complaining about the store's policy. Something about carrying that big bag, she said, pointing to a black duffel at the man's feet. The man turned towards CJ, eyes cool but polite. "Officer, maybe you can help clear this up," the man said, his voice level. "I was just telling the cashier here that I'm fine with leaving my bag in the car, if that's their policy. But I wanted to see a sign posted or some formal notice first. She asked me to step outside, but it's nearly 100 degrees. CJ's expression hardened, and his preconceived notions roared to the surface. "Is there a problem following simple rules?" He snapped, ignoring the man's calm explanation. "If she says you leave the bag in the car, then you leave it in the car." The man gave a brief, measured nod. "I would do so if the rule was clear and publicly posted. It's not that I refuse to comply, I'm just asking for clarity on store policy. I don't want to keep coming in and out if it's not allowed." The cashier tried to cut in, looking uncomfortable. "Officer, I told him he could just leave it outside, but I guess we never put up the new signs. My manager, Hal, he keeps meaning to." CJ waved a dismissive hand at her, stepping forward, chest puffed up. "Show me some ID," he barked at the man. "Sure," the man responded, face unflinching. He reached into his back pocket slowly, retrieving a driver's license from an out-of-state wallet. CJ took it and immediately zoned in on the name Michael Lawson. The address indicated Chicago, Illinois. CJ's thoughts buzzed with an unspoken bias about big city folks. He glared at Michael as if his very presence was an affront. "That your vehicle out there with the fancy new plates?" CJ said, nodding at the direction of the parking lot. "Yes. I just moved into town a few days ago," Michael answered. CJ huffed. "Just moved, huh? And you're already stirring up trouble at a local business?" Michael let out a small sigh. "Sir, I'm not stirring up trouble. I just asked a question about store policy." "Outside," CJ snapped, hooking a finger in an order. "We'll talk there." He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel, expecting compliance without question. The cashier looked concerned, but said nothing. As Michael followed, he picked up his black duffel bag. There was a flicker of tension in the air, a sense that something was about to go wrong. Out in the parking lot, the heat bore down like a physical weight. CJ quickly scanned the bag. "Open it," he demanded. "I need to see what's inside." Michael parted the zipper. Inside were files, a neatly folded shirt, and an assortment of papers. CJ's suspicious stare lingered. "Why do you have all these files?" Michael answered politely. "They're notes on police training, updated policies from a program I worked on in Chicago, and some leadership materials." But CJ cut him off before he could finish, adrenaline fueling his next move. "I'm placing you under arrest for refusing to comply with a lawful order," CJ snapped, twisting Michael's arm behind his back. Michael winced but didn't resist physically. He only managed to say, "Refusing to comply? I'm cooperating. The older man in overalls near the store entrance stood, wide-eyed. A small crowd of curious onlookers began to gather, sensing an altercation. The cashier emerged, looking alarmed. CJ pressed Michael against the side of his squad car. "Shut up," he hissed, cuffing him with swift aggression. "I gave you an order to open the bag." "You gave me lip." "What are you talking about?" Michael asked, breath uneven, but voice still controlled. "I opened it as you asked. Why am I being arrested? You want to argue with me?" CJ snarled. "We can do that down at the station." He shoved Michael into the back of the patrol car. Michael's eyes flicked with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. The bystanders' muttering grew as CJ hopped into the driver's seat and reversed away from the convenience store. Michael's duffel lay on the sidewalk, files scattering in the gust of wind behind them. No one dared approach the bag while CJ was still in sight. Once the patrol car screeched out of the parking lot, the older man in overalls picked up the duffel, looking perplexed. The cashier retrieved some of the loose papers, glancing at the titles "Effective Community Policing, Officer Training Program Modules, Chief of Police Onboarding Packet." Her eyes widened with realization. She exchanged a concerned look with the older man. Meanwhile, in the back of the patrol car, Michael tried to remain calm. He had dealt with confrontations and misunderstandings before, especially in his line of work. But this was different. He was in a place he had hoped to call home, and the hostility felt personal. The deeper frustration gnawed at him. How would this look when it became public that the new chief of police was arrested by one of his own, soon-to-be subordinates? Once at the station, CJ led Michael in with a firm grip on his arm. A few officers looked up from their desks, expressions puzzled as they recognized that CJ had brought in a well-dressed man in cuffs. Chief Byron Stokes's door was slightly ajar. Hearing the commotion, he stepped out, wearing a concerned frown. He made eye contact with Michael, who simply gave a small, tense nod, as if to say, "We'll talk later." "What's going on, Jennings?" Stokes asked, voice carrying the weight of authority. "Disturbance at Hal's," CJ said crisply, refusing to meet the chief's gaze directly. He refused to comply with orders, made a scene, had suspicious items in a bag, files, might be stolen property or something. Stokes's brow furrowed. He looked at Michael, then back at CJ. "Jennings," he said quietly, "I want to speak to you in my office. Now." He signaled another officer to take Michael to a holding area for processing, just to keep the peace momentarily. Michael gave a calm, if exasperated, exhale as he was led away. Inside Stokes's office, CJ stood, arms folded, posture defensive. Stokes spoke softly but firmly. "Do you have any idea who that man is?" CJ's eyes darted. He said his name was Michael Lawson, out-of-state license from Chicago, probably up to no good, some kind of agitator, I bet. Stokes closed his eyes for a moment, visibly reining in his frustration. Then he spoke in a grave tone. "He's the new chief of police, Jennings. The city council hired him. He starts next week." For a heartbeat, CJ's mind went blank. Then a storm of confusion, fear and denial rushed in. That can't be right. Why would they pick someone like him? He was causing trouble. Stokes's glare cut him off. He wasn't causing trouble. He was shopping at Hal's. He's been here a few days to get settled, and you've arrested him for no valid reason. "Jennings, do you realize the magnitude of what you've done?" CJ's jaw clenched, but he was being disrespectful. "I gave him a lawful order." Stokes slammed a hand on his desk, uncharacteristically losing composure. "You listen to me, son. You have just humiliated a high-ranking law enforcement professional in public. Worse yet, you've revealed your biases in a way that might cost this entire department dearly. Do you have any evidence of a crime?" He refused to comply with an order," CJ stammered. "Did he fight you?" Did he refuse to open the bag? Stokes demanded. CJ hesitated. He opened it, but he gave me attitude. Stokes stared at CJ as if seeing him for the first time. We're dropping all charges immediately. I'll handle the paperwork. You owe him an apology. A big one. His voice quivered with anger. Now get out of my office. CJ, stung by humiliation and confusion, left in a sullen haze. He returned to the hallway just as another officer emerged from the holding area with Michael. The cuffs were gone, and Michael massaged his wrists. Their eyes met, and CJ looked away, face burning. He heard Michael's voice, calm but resonant, speaking to Chief Stokes. I understand these things happen, but we need to address the deeper issues here if I'm going to lead effectively. CJ felt a flush of anger and shame. How could this man, a stranger and a black man no less, in CJ's bigoted worldview, be the next chief of police here in Greenvale? The ground felt like it was crumbling under CJ's feet. News traveled fast. Within hours, nearly every officer and dispatcher in the station heard that Michael Lawson, the new chief, had been arrested by CJ for no legitimate reason. A few officers smirked at CJ's foolishness, while others whispered that the department might see massive policy changes. A small number were uneasy, worried about what lay ahead. Chief Stokes and Michael spent most of the afternoon in Stokes's office, discussing the fiasco. CJ nursed his wounded pride in the break room, sipping coffee that tasted bitter on his tongue. He avoided everyone's eyes. Normally, CJ relished telling war stories of his arrests, but now he slumped silently, the shame evident. By the next day, official statements had been prepared. Michael, in a magnanimous move, declined to file personal complaints or lawsuits against CJ or the department. He insisted that the bigger priority was healing and reform. I prefer to approach this from a standpoint of improvement, not punishment, he said to the city council in a private meeting. However, the council members were appalled by CJ's conduct, and rumors swirled that they might pressure Chief Stokes to fire CJ outright before Michael took over. Despite the tension, Michael asked Chief Stokes not to dismiss CJ immediately. Let me handle it once I'm sworn in, Michael said, a measured determination in his voice. It'll set an example one way or another of how we deal with problems in this department. On Monday morning, Michael Lawson officially took the oath to become Greenvale's new chief of police. City Hall was packed with spectators, council members, local business owners, curious residents, and the entire police force. Even some out-of-town reporters were present, having caught wind of the drama. The atmosphere felt charged. Half the crowd seemed enthralled by the idea of a new era, while the other half waited, uncertain or skeptical. Michael delivered a heartfelt speech, emphasizing unity, trust, and accountability. He pledged to foster relationships with community leaders, revise training protocols, and champion a more transparent form of policing. His voice carried conviction and warmth. Those who met him for the first time that day spoke afterward about his magnetic presence, how he seemed genuinely devoted to serving others. Standing in the back, CJ squirmed in his uniform, his gaze flicking between the polished man at the podium and the restless audience. CJ felt like a spotlight was on him, even though no one was looking his way. He couldn't stop replaying the moment he slammed Michael against his patrol car. The memory clawed at him. People who recognized CJ gave him cautious looks. He felt a simmering anger at Michael for daring to come here and upend his world. At the same time, he felt a rock of guilt in his stomach that he couldn't dislodge. After the ceremony ended, the officers lined up to congratulate the new chief. One by one, they shook Michael's hand or offered a respectful salute. When CJ reached him, he froze, uncertain how to act. The entire line seemed to hold its breath. Michael offered a calm nod, extending his hand. CJ's face reddened as he shook it. He managed a stilted apology, mumbling, "I'm sorry about the misunderstanding." Michael only replied softly, "We'll talk more soon, Officer Jennings." Those words left CJ unsettled. He knew a reckoning was coming. In the days that followed, Michael wasted no time assessing the department. He reviewed the disciplinary records, studied the current training curriculum, and met with each officer individually. When CJ's turn came for a one-on-one meeting, the tension was palpable. Michael sat behind the chief's desk, a symbol of the power. CJ had tried to abuse and asked CJ to take a seat across from him. Silence lingered for a moment. CJ swallowed hard. Michael's eyes held neither malice nor triumph, but a resolute seriousness. Finally, the new chief spoke. "Officer Jennings, I want you to know that I understand how long-time officers might feel threatened by an outsider. Changes can be tough, especially in a close-knit place like Greenvale. But you crossed a line. You violated my rights and your oath." CJ's mouth felt dry. He groped for words. A small part of him wanted to confess his biases, to explain that he'd acted out of fear or ignorance. Yet pride dominated. "I believed you were a threat." Michael's gaze didn't flinch. "On what grounds?" CJ stiffened. "Your attitude. You had a bag full of documents. You refused to obey my commands." Michael exhaled. "Let's cut the formalities. You're lying to yourself if you say it wasn't at least partially racially motivated. I've seen it happen countless times." CJ's heart hammered. He shifted in his seat. "I'm not racist. My father was a good cop. My grandfather," Michael held up a hand. "Stop. I'm not here to debate your ancestors. I'm here to hold you accountable and help you become a better officer, if that's even possible. Here's what's going to happen. I'm placing you on a mandatory diversity and de-escalation training program. It'll be a combination of classroom instruction, supervised patrol shifts with a senior officer, and community service in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods. You'll also deliver a formal apology in front of your peers and a separate one to the members of the community you've wronged, starting with Hal's convenience store." CJ's cheeks flushed with anger and humiliation. "You can't do that. I can, and I will," Michael replied firmly, leaning forward. "If you don't comply, I'll recommend your termination immediately. And if you make it through the training but fail to improve, you're gone. Is that clear?" CJ clenched his fists. "Yes, Chief." Michael nodded. "Good. Dismissed." CJ stood and left, boiling with resentment. He felt singled out, punished unjustly. A voice in his head snarled, "This is your department, your town. How dare he come in and do this?" Another quieter voice whispered, "You brought this on yourself." But CJ shoved that thought aside and marched out, vowing to prove he was in the right. Time passed, and CJ grudgingly began the training sessions. He sat in cramped conference rooms, forced to listen to lectures about cultural sensitivity and the importance of fair policing. He watched body cam footage from other departments that illustrated how unconscious bias could escalate even routine stops into disastrous outcomes. Most times, CJ tried to tune it out, arms folded, gaze distant, but certain videos seeped through his defenses, pricking at the edges of his conscience. The supervised patrol shifts were even more grating. He rode alongside Lieutenant Grace Morales, a respected officer known for her calm demeanor and excellent rapport with minority neighborhoods. Where CJ might bark orders or approach a situation with intimidation, Grace took a gentler approach. She listened, explained, and built trust. Over time, CJ couldn't deny that people responded positively to her methods. He noticed that calls that might have ended in conflict were resolved with a handshake and a promise to do better. A small corner of his mind began to wonder if his own approach had always been flawed. Then came the community service component. Michael specifically assigned CJ to volunteer at the Unity Community Center, located in a historically black neighborhood on Greenvale's outskirts. CJ found himself sorting donated clothes, cleaning up a vandalized playground, and serving hot meals at a soup kitchen. He worked under the watchful eye of community organizer Lena Harrison, who had long advocated for better police-community relations. Lena didn't mince words with CJ. She laid out the mistrust the neighborhood felt, the historical reasons for their wariness of law enforcement, and the frustration that came from being profiled or harassed. CJ initially bristled at her lectures, but as the days wore on, he saw the community's struggles up close, the single mother working 2 jobs yet still barely affording groceries, the young man with a college acceptance letter but riddled with anxiety from repeated police stops, the older folks who had marched for civil rights decades earlier and still felt they hadn't fully won. To CJ's surprise, some locals recognized him as the officer who arrested the new chief. He saw the skepticism in their eyes, the coldness in their greetings. He felt a pang of humiliation. This was the harsh reflection of the image he'd created. Yet as he continued to show up daily, doing his share of labor without complaining, a few people softened. One elderly woman named Miss S. Johnson even smiled at him one day as he handed her a bag of fresh produce. "We'll see if you change, Officer Jennings," she said, her voice creaking with age. "We'll see." Those words settled like a challenge in his mind. Over time, the more he served, the more he listened to the stories of the people he was helping, the more complicated everything became. He realized how limited his own worldview had been, shaped by generations of policing that saw certain communities as enemies rather than neighbors. It was uncomfortable to confront that possibility, but the seeds of doubt in his old ways had been planted. Despite these shifts, CJ still resisted, acknowledging that race played a role in his attitudes. He told himself he'd only been doing his job. Then, one blistering afternoon, Grace Morales asked CJ to accompany her on a call about a potential break-in at a run-down apartment complex in the same neighborhood where CJ was volunteering. When they arrived, they found a teenage boy, no older than 16, trying to pry open a window. He dropped his makeshift crowbar and bolted, but Grace called out in a gentle tone, "Hey, it's okay, we just want to talk." The boy paused, trembling. CJ's instinct was to grab the boy, cuff him, and ask questions later, but Grace walked over slowly, her hands visible, voice calm. "Is this your apartment?" she asked. The boy swallowed, nodding. "Then why are you breaking in?" she asked, not accusingly but curiously. The boy stammered, "My mum's not home. She locked the door, and I don't have a key. She won't be back until late." "I was hungry, and it's hot out here," CJ observed, arms folded. He was waiting for an excuse to get tough. But the boy's eyes brimmed with tears, and he realized the crime was the desperate action of a kid locked out of his own home. Grace let out a small sigh of relief. "All right, let's see if we can reach your mum or someone with a spare key. In the meantime, let's get you some water." CJ felt his chest tighten. A memory surfaced of himself at that age, locked out after school because his parents were both working overtime. He remembered rummaging around the backyard, trying to find a way in. He'd never shared that memory with anyone. The parallel punched him in the gut. The boy was taken to the community center while Grace contacted the mother. She confirmed that her shift wouldn't end for another 6 hours and apologized profusely. Grace told her not to worry, that they'd look after her son at the center until she could come get him. As CJ watched this unfold, shame crept over him. He realized that a year ago, he might have treated that boy as a criminal, slapped on cuffs, and thrown him into juvenile detention for attempted burglary. The thought made him nauseous. Grace's approach, the department's new approach under Chief Lawson, was so different, yet it resolved the situation without scarring a young life. A few weeks into his mandated program, CJ found himself scheduled to apologize formally at Hal's convenience store. Word had spread, and a small gathering of residents and store employees awaited outside. Hal, an aging man with a potbelly and warm grin, was a beloved figure in the community. He had decided to witness CJ's apology personally. The sun glinted off the glass doors of the store as CJ stepped out of his patrol car. His uniform felt heavier than usual. Michael stood nearby, arms crossed, not gloating, merely observing. Lena Harrison from the community center was also present, along with the cashier who had witnessed the arrest. CJ saw the older man in overalls who had picked up Michael's duffel bag that day. All eyes were on CJ. The silence was deafening as CJ cleared his throat. I wanted to say sorry," he began, voice faltering, "to Hal, to the employees, to the witnesses that day. I acted out of line, arresting Michael Lawson without proper cause. My actions caused distress and were not representative of what this uniform stands for." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I also want to apologize for any pain or mistrust I've caused members of this community through my words or actions. I understand now how my biases and methods were harmful. I promise to do better." He bowed his head, chest tight with anxiety, unsure if the crowd would sneer or accept his words. To his surprise, Hal placed a hand on CJ's shoulder. "Boy, everyone makes mistakes," Hal said kindly, though his eyes carried gravity. "We'll be watching to see if you mean it." The cashier nodded. The older man in overalls studied CJ for a long moment, then said, "Prove it in your work from now on." Several onlookers gave approving nods, though their expressions remained guarded. They were willing to see if CJ's transformation was real, but trust would not be earned overnight. Standing off to the side, Michael offered a curt nod, indicating that CJ had taken a step in the right direction. CJ exhaled shakily, a sense of relief warring with the knowledge that his journey was far from over. Greenvale's transformations under Chief Lawson didn't come without resistance. A small faction of older officers voiced concerns about handcuffing the police with too many regulations. They complained about the mandatory cultural training sessions. Some even vented that Michael's approach was too soft and would invite criminals to run rampant. A local talk radio host named Jerry Whitman seized on this discontent, broadcasting near daily tirades against big city policing in our small town, fanning the flames of skepticism and fear. Meanwhile, an influential local businessman, Greg Hamilton, quietly opposed Michael's reforms. Hamilton owned multiple rental properties and held a seat on the Chamber of Commerce. He had a long-standing arrangement with certain officers look the other way on code violations, and he'd donate generously to police fundraisers. With Michael pushing for higher accountability, Hamilton felt threatened. He began meeting privately with a few disgruntled officers to encourage their dissent. CJ found himself invited to one of those gatherings. In a smoky backroom of a local bar, Hamilton spoke with fervor. "We can't let this new chief tear apart the department," he insisted. "He's only been here a short time, and he's already stepping on all your toes." CJ listened uneasily. He had his own misgivings, but something about Hamilton's tone rubbed him the wrong way. It was too self-serving. This wasn't about the community's good. It was about Hamilton's power. Hamilton glanced at CJ specifically. "Officer Jennings, I heard you got singled out. You must want revenge." CJ stiffened. He couldn't deny he still wrestled with anger toward Michael, but he also recognized how misguided Hamilton's viewpoint was. "Chief Lawson is tough, but maybe the department needs some changes," CJ said quietly. That answer didn't please Hamilton, whose smile faltered. The other officers in the room shared wary looks. It was becoming clear that CJ was no longer as easily swayed by the old guard's rhetoric as he once had been. Hamilton dismissed CJ with a wave. "We'll talk later," he said tersely, eyes narrowed. CJ left the meeting feeling torn. A few months prior, he might have eagerly joined Hamilton's cause, seeing Michael as an enemy. Now, though, a sliver of conscience told him that Michael was trying to do good. One night, a frantic 911 call came in from an apartment complex on the outskirts of Greenvale, the same area. CJ had patrolled with Grace, the same area where the community center was located. Shots were fired, the dispatcher said, and multiple people were down. Patrol units scrambled. Michael, determined not to remain behind a desk, hopped into a cruiser with Lieutenant Morales. CJ and another officer arrived soon after. The scene was chaotic. Flickering streetlights illuminated shattered glass and bullet casings. Two teenagers lay bleeding on the ground. Terrified residents crouched behind cars and doorways. At first glance, it looked like a drive-by shooting or a gang-related dispute. Michael and Grace raced to help the victims, radioing for EMTs. CJ secured the perimeter, his senses on high alert. As more officers swarmed in, they discovered an older man, trembling, still clutching a handgun. He was kneeling beside a battered sedan, tears streaking his face. They were messing with my car," he stammered. "I didn't know they were just kids. I thought they were going to rob me. I just wanted to scare them." The man's voice cracked. Michael carefully approached, palms forward. "Sir, put the gun down. Let's help these kids." The man surrendered the weapon, collapsing into sobs. It turned out the teenagers had been tagging a nearby wall and messing around the man's car. Startled, he'd opened fire, thinking they were armed. The heartbreak of it settled like a heavy fog over the scene. CJ helped load the injured teens onto stretchers, feeling an ache in his chest. He realized with a jolt that the entire tragedy stemmed from fear and suspicion. The man had seen the youths as threats, not as kids making a dumb choice. CJ flashed back to his own rash actions with Michael. A wave of nausea rolled over him as he saw how easily fear could escalate into irreversible violence. As the night wore on, the man was taken into custody. The teens were rushed into surgery, and the officers filed reports. Michael seemed shaken yet resolute, reminding every officer on scene to show compassion and to remain professional. In the weeks following the shooting, the community was on edge. Protests broke out, calling for stricter gun regulations and more community-based interventions. Michael addressed the crowd at a town hall, acknowledging the anger and pain, promising to expand youth outreach programs and mental health services. CJ stood by, no longer the front-line face of the department, but he listened intently. He felt a pang of guilt every time he heard the protesters' refrain, "Stop the fear, stop the hate." Behind the scenes, Greg Hamilton escalated his own campaign against Michael, claiming that soft policing led to the tragedy, even though it had been an armed citizen who shot the teens. A swirl of misinformation painted Michael as the problem, fueling resentment among certain corners of Greenvale. The tension threatened to split the community into factions, those who believed in Michael's vision and those who yearned for the old ways. CJ found himself at a personal crossroads. Old alliances beckoned him to stand against the new chief, but his conscience, the one that had been awakened through training and direct exposure to the community, whispered a different path. Late one night, he sat alone in his car outside the deserted police station, turning on the radio. He caught Jerry Whitman's talk show, hearing venomous rants against Michael. CJ suddenly couldn't stomach it. He switched the radio off, leaning his head against the steering wheel. He recalled a conversation he once had with his father, who told him that the badge was a shield and a reminder to protect, never to harm. When had CJ lost sight of that? The realization left him feeling raw. Shortly after, an anonymous tip came in that a local property of Greg Hamilton's might be connected to drug trafficking. Michael dispatched a small team to investigate. CJ volunteered to go along, wanting to prove that he was capable of serving justice, regardless of whose interests were at stake. The property turned out to be a dingy warehouse on the outskirts of town. Faded signs warned trespassers to stay away. The moment the officers arrived, they sensed something was off. The place was eerily quiet, yet there were lights glowing inside. They moved incautiously, weapons drawn, standard procedure for a possible drug bust. Inside, they found crates of stolen goods, unregistered firearms, and packets of illegal substances. As they combed through the evidence, a startled security guard attempted to flee. CJ and two other officers gave chase, tackling the guard near a side exit. He babbled about doing it for Hamilton and never intended to hurt nobody. When Michael arrived, panting from a run, he exchanged a grim look with CJ. This bust led directly to one of Greenvale's most prominent figures. Armed with evidence, Michael confronted Hamilton, who tried to bribe him. When that failed, Hamilton tried to leverage his connections on the city council, but the facts were too damning. He was arrested, charged with conspiracy and abetting criminal activity. The local news plastered his mugshot in their headlines. CJ ended up testifying truthfully about everything he witnessed at the warehouse, refusing to protect Hamilton. While a year ago he might have hesitated, now he felt compelled to do the right thing, especially after everything he'd learned. Hamilton's downfall made waves. The secret alliances, the corruption, it all came spilling out. Many in the community felt vindicated, grateful that justice was being served, no matter how powerful the perpetrator. Michael, standing in Greenvale, soared. While some diehards still resented him, it became clear that his brand of leadership had uncovered and dismantled a corrupt network that the old guard had either ignored or protected. As all this unfolded, CJ found himself face to face with the karmic repercussions of his life choices. He realized that the petty arrogance and bigotry he once displayed were part of a broader culture that enabled men like Hamilton to manipulate the system. By the time Hamilton's arrest was complete and the public saw how thoroughly the man had compromised the town's ethics, CJ couldn't avoid reckoning with his own complicity. For CJ, the final blow of karma came when internal affairs, spurred by Michael's reforms, looked into all questionable arrests made in the last 5 years. CJ's name popped up repeatedly. Even though Michael was willing to give him a second chance, other investigators recommended that CJ face disciplinary action or demotion for his pattern of misconduct. After reviewing dozens of body cam videos and testimonies, the board offered CJ a choice: resign or accept a demotion and endure a stringent probationary period. The CJ of old would have fought tooth and nail to keep his rank, but now, with guilt eating at him, CJ found the question of his future weighed heavily. In a private meeting, Michael asked CJ what he wanted to do. CJ let out a long breath. "I used to think I was above the rules," he admitted, voice trembling. "Now I realize I've done real damage. I'm sorry, Chief, not just for what I did to you that day, but for every person I've treated poorly. I want to make it right if I can." Michael's demeanor was calm. "I see you've grown, CJ, but trust has to be earned. I'll support your choice, whether that's leaving the force or starting anew at a lower rank." CJ nodded, tears threatening to break free. "I want to stay if you'll have me. I want to learn how to do this job the right way." So CJ accepted the demotion. He found himself walking a beat under the watchful eye of Lieutenant Morales, wearing the uniform but no longer swaggering with false authority. Though it stung his pride, a strange sense of relief filled him, like stepping into the light after dwelling too long in darkness. Months later, Greenvale had begun to feel like a different town. Under Michael's leadership, the police department hired new officers with diverse backgrounds, expanded community programs, and made efforts to rebuild trust. Internal accountability measures, including regular cultural sensitivity training and unbiased policing reviews, became standard. Longtime residents noted that, little by little, the town's policing style was changing. Crime hadn't disappeared, no community was perfect, but the relationship between law enforcement and citizens was evolving. People were less afraid to call 911, more willing to cooperate. CJ continued to volunteer at the Unity Community Center, forging connections with youth and adults he once might have profiled. The memory of the teenage boy prying open his own window haunted him, reminding him that every interaction had a context and a consequence. When CJ sometimes encountered Michael in the halls, he offered a respectful nod. Michael would nod back with a slight smile, an unspoken acknowledgement of CJ's progress. Neither man pretended the past hadn't happened, but they focused on moving forward. Word eventually spread beyond Greenvale about the transformation spearheaded by the new chief of police, Michael Lawson. Journalists from the Houston Chronicle and even NBC affiliates came to interview him about reducing tension between police and citizens in a small southern town with a history of racial divides. Michael never took full credit, always praising community leaders like Lena Harrison, officers like Grace Morales, and the volunteers who made it happen. He also subtly referenced CJ's story without naming him when discussing departmental reform. Sometimes, individuals come to realize their own biases only after a painful reckoning, he said in one interview. But that reckoning can lead to growth, and that's what we aim for here in Greenvale. Behind the scenes, CJ continued his probationary period, diligently working on building a reputation as a fair, compassionate officer. The road was far from smooth. Old doubts and ingrained prejudices didn't vanish overnight. Yet every time CJ was tempted to revert to his former attitude, he remembered the day he arrested Michael Lawson outside Hal's, the humiliation he'd felt, and how close he'd come to losing everything. That memory was enough to keep him on track. Karma had hit CJ hard. He lost his rank, his respect, and nearly his entire career. But in losing those things, he gained something more valuable: humility, empathy, and an understanding of the real purpose of the badge he wore. The town that once turned a blind eye to biases was waking up, slowly forging a path toward genuine reform. CJ discovered that by acknowledging his failings, he could begin to rebuild himself into a better man and a better officer. And so, the man who once thought he'd already achieved power and respect learned that true authority comes from service, empathy, and justice, values embodied by the new chief he had so rashly arrested. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it guaranteed to be permanent without continuous effort. But day by day, Greenvale inched away from its old ways, led by a chief who believed in redemption and guided by the principle that everyone deserved dignity, fairness, and a second chance. Even a racist cop who arrested a black man, only to discover he was his new boss. Thank you for joining us on this winding journey of pride, prejudice, and redemption. Officer CJ's downfall and rebirth serve as a cautionary tale about how easily fear and bias can turn protectors into oppressors, and how one person's determination and empathy can inspire change in an entire community. Chief Michael Lawson's unwavering commitment to fairness and justice reminds us that progress is possible even in the face of deep-seated distrust. Real transformation takes courage, humility, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. If you found hope and inspiration in this story, or if it moved you to think about the power of accountability and second chances, please show your support. Like this video, share it with friends and family who need to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking stories. Together, we can shine a light on injustice and forge a brighter, more compassionate future for all.